In 1975, a Tibetan child just 3 years old stood before a Western monk and with a serene gaze pointed to an ancient golden reliquary. "That was mine," he said, with the casualness of someone recognizing a childhood toy. The object, a sacred item kept under strict watch at the Rumtek Monastery in Sikkim, was part of the belongings of the 16th Karmapa, who had passed away only a year earlier. But what drew attention wasn't just the child's isolated gesture. It was the fact that he knew the names of disciples, the monastery's internal routines, and even intimate details about the spiritual leader's death. According to the records, none of this could have been taught to him. Thus began one of the most controversial and disputed cases of reincarnation recognition in the 20th century. The boy was identified as Urgyen Trinley Dorje, born in Latok, in the Kham region of eastern Tibet, in 1985, but the search for his spiritual identity had been underway since the death of the 16th Karmapa, Rangjung Rigpe Dorje, in Chicago in 1981. During his life, Rangjung had established contact with Western figures, including psychologists and doctors interested in the phenomenon of post-death consciousness. One of those names was Elizabeth Kübler-Ross, a Swiss-American psychiatrist who, in the 1970s, became an international authority on near-death experiences and spiritual transition. Kübler-Ross visited India on several occasions, where she met with Buddhist leaders and explored the Tibetan view on death. Although she never publicly claimed to be involved in the specific investigation of the Karmapa's reincarnation, she mentioned in interviews and writings the conviction with which certain Eastern spiritual traditions treated the continuity of consciousness. "Death is just a change of state, not an end," she would say in packed lectures across Europe and the United States. The recognition of a new incarnation of the Karmapa is traditionally conducted through a combination of signs, prophetic dreams, hidden objects, and rigorous tests carried out by high-ranking lamas of the Karma Kagyu lineage. But in the case of Urgyen Trinley Dorje, the identification took on geopolitical overtones. His official validation in 1992 not only reignited the faith of thousands of followers in the Himalayas, but also divided the Tibetan Buddhist world itself and attracted the attention of Western scholars. The child, now recognized by a majority faction as the 17th Karmapa, began living under intense protection, alternating between retreat and spiritual training. However, another child was also recognized by a different group of masters as the true successor. From that point on, what seemed to be a simple tradition of spiritual continuity became a minefield of religious disputes, political pressure, and unanswered questions about what consciousness is actually capable of remembering. The investigation into this child's memory and the role that names like Kübler-Ross played in legitimizing the debate in the West reveals more than just an isolated case. It is a portrait of how ancient traditions collide with modern science and how a child can become the symbol of one of the greatest spiritual controversies of our time. In January 1985, when Urgyen Trinley Dorje was born, his family lived in a remote region of Tibet, far from the major monasteries and communication networks. As devout Buddhist peasants, the parents had no direct ties to the monastic hierarchy. However, accounts from the mother indicate that during her pregnancy, she had intense dreams of sacred figures and the sounds of ceremonial drums. According to Tibetan tradition, these dreams are considered auspicious signs. A few years later, emissaries from the Karma Kagyu lineage arrived in the region, conducting a quiet search for signs of the 16th Karmapa's reincarnation. They were following clues left in an enigmatic letter, supposedly written by the Karmapa himself before his death, detailing his next incarnation. Although there are debates regarding the document's authenticity, many monks claim it referenced a specific area of Kham and a family with certain characteristics. When they found Urgyen Trinley at just 2 years old, the monks conducted a series of observations. They didn't just witness behaviors unusual for a child of that age, such as spontaneous meditation and the recitation of complex mantras. They also subjected the boy to traditional tests, recognizing the previous Karmapa's objects among similar items, reacting to the names of former disciples, and showing familiarity with environments he had never visited. The accuracy of his answers impressed the senior monks, but in the West, many remained skeptical. Was it possible the parents had been coached? Could there have been some form of hidden training? Elizabeth Kübler-Ross, while not directly involved in the case, had already expressed in interviews that young children, with their spontaneity and lack of filters, sometimes reveal memories that defy the linear concept of time. For her, accounts of reincarnation could not be dismissed as mere fantasy or fraud, especially when verified at such early ages before the emergence of more complex social influences. The official proclamation of Urgyen Trinley as the 17th Karmapa occurred in 1992, with the backing of the 14th Dalai Lama, which gave him enormous international legitimacy. However, a second proclamation, made in parallel by another influential group in the lineage, recognized a young man named Trinley Thay Dorje as the true successor. This event sparked the so-called Two Karmapas controversy, dividing monastic communities, international organizations, and even governments involved with the Tibetan exile. In this context, the case was no longer just spiritual. It also became a dispute over leadership, influence, and cultural identity. Meanwhile, Western scholars began to analyze reports of spontaneous childhood memory with a new perspective, influenced by decades of research into post-death consciousness, including the work of Kübler-Ross and also Ian Stevenson, a Canadian psychiatrist who, until 2007, documented hundreds of cases of children with past life memories around the world. The central question remained: how could the memory of something that shouldn't be remembered be explained using the tools of modern science? At 7 years old, Urgyen Trinley Dorje was taken to Tsurphu Monastery, the traditional seat of the Karma Kagyu lineage, on the outskirts of Lhasa in central Tibet. It was a symbolic return. The monastery had been severely damaged during the Chinese Cultural Revolution, but was beginning to be restored as part of China's strategic control over Tibetan religiosity. The enthronement ceremony was carefully recorded by authorities and covered by the Chinese press. But what most people didn't see was the child's behavior behind the scenes. Monks close to him report that Urgyen Trinley recognized corridors, hidden rooms, and even a small private altar where the previous Karmapa had kept a concealed relic. He accurately pointed out the existence of secret compartments in walls that could only have been known by someone who had lived there before. None of the assistants, not even the elders, knew such details. It was this type of evidence that led figures in Tibetan Buddhism, including the Dalai Lama himself, to publicly affirm their support for him. However, in Dharamsala, where the Tibetan government in exile was based, not everyone was convinced. Trinley Thay Dorje, recognized in parallel by Shamar Rinpoche, one of the 4 traditional regents of the lineage, also displayed characteristics considered typical of an authentic reincarnation. Growing up in a different environment, protected outside of Tibet, Thay Dorje began his training in India, following a more discreet path but gaining support across various Tibetan diaspora communities and Western Buddhists, especially in Europe. The rivalry between the two lineages didn't just involve belief. It activated deep collective memories regarding spiritual legitimacy, authority, and cultural survival. Between the 1980s and 1990s, the issue of the Karmapa's succession was no longer just a dispute between lamas, but also between political systems. China supported Urgyen Trinley as a tool for symbolic control in Tibet, while exiles sought to keep traditions alive, independent of state influence. For scholars in the West, such as those following the legacy of Elizabeth Kübler-Ross, the situation was complex. Kübler-Ross had ended her public career in 1995 following health issues, but her impact continued in academic and spiritual circles. In particular, her empathetic approach to end-of-life experiences had paved the way for the recognition of phenomena like spontaneous regressions and reincarnation accounts as legitimate subjects of psychological investigation. During a 1983 conference in Switzerland, Kübler-Ross responded to a question about the Karmapa case by saying that, if consciousness does not die, then we need to listen more carefully to those who still know how to hear it. This statement, while poetic, helped legitimize a more open approach in the West, something that also interested scientists like Ian Stevenson, who sought exactly this kind of spontaneous report in young children with little exposure to outside information. Meanwhile, Urgayen Trinley continued to be prepared to lead millions of practitioners of the Karma Kagyu lineage, but he did not remain passive. As the years went by, his own awareness of the situation grew, as did the political tensions surrounding his figure. In the winter of 1999, an unexpected event broke the routine of Surfu Monastery. At just 14 years old, Urgayen Trinley Dorje led a clandestine escape from Tibet, crossing the Himalayas in silence with a small group of trusted monks. For 8 days, they faced extreme temperatures, military surveillance outposts, and snow-covered trails until they reached the border with Nepal, and from there, they headed to India. When the news reached the international community, many were stunned. How had a child, raised under the watchful eye of Chinese authorities, escaped one of the most monitored regions on the planet? The reason for the escape, according to later accounts by the Karmapa himself, lay in the impasse between his spiritual mission and the restrictions imposed by the Chinese government. In rare interviews, he explained that he needed to complete his religious education, which would only be possible in India, alongside the great masters in exile. The escape reinforced, in the eyes of many, his authenticity as a spiritual leader. "I did not flee for political reasons," he declared years later. "I fled because it was my duty to continue the path started in previous lives." The impact was immediate. In Dharamsala, the Dalai Lama officially received him, further consolidating his status among followers of the Kagyu school. But the presence of two recognized Karmapas continued to divide communities. Some scholars compared the situation to a silent schism, where neither side declared open war, but the practical consequences became visible. Temples choosing one name and avoiding the other, confused disciples and masters feeling forced to take sides. In Germany, the case gained attention within Buddhist and academic circles. During the early 2000s, universities in Berlin, Heidelberg, and Hamburg organized symposiums on reincarnation and spiritual identity, inviting experts in Tibetan culture, psychology, and neuroscience. Elizabeth Kübler-Ross was frequently cited as a pioneer in the debate on the continuity of consciousness, especially for her work with children who reported experiences beyond death. Behind the scenes of these events, an uncomfortable question was raised. If two individuals show legitimate signs of continuity of consciousness, is it possible that both are authentic expressions of the same mind? This hypothesis, though a minority view, was briefly considered by some lamas who saw the duality as a reflection of the very times they lived in. A fragmented world where the sacred and the political are inseparably intertwined. At the same time, Western experts like Jim Tucker, Ian Stevenson's successor at the University of Virginia, continued to study similar cases, especially those involving spontaneous childhood testimony. Although the focus was generally on more discrete situations, such as children in the United States or Lebanon who remembered names and details from previous lives, the Karmapa case stood out for being deeply embedded in a structured tradition of reincarnation, with ancient protocols and global consequences. It was a rare case where faith, politics, and psychology were intertwined. And at the center of it all, a child, or two, carrying memories that defied conventional logic. As the years passed, Urgayen Trinley Dorje transitioned from a silent symbol to an active public figure. Fluent in English, he began dialogues with young Buddhists, environmentalists, and human rights activists, At conferences in India and the West, he addressed topics such as cultural identity, compassion, and the climate crisis. A bold step for someone whose very existence was a target of international tension. Even so, he never wavered in his commitment to the values of the Karma Kagyu lineage. Meanwhile, Trinlithey Dorje, the other recognized as the 17th Karmapa, also followed his own path. Based in Kalimpong, India, he adopted a more reserved profile, focusing on traditional training and visiting Buddhist centers in Europe, particularly in Germany and Switzerland. In 2017, he married a European lay student, a decision that surprised some followers but was accepted naturally by others as a sign of a modern approach to Buddhist practice. In Germany, where Tibetan Buddhism has found a receptive audience since the 1970s, centers linked to both figures coexisted, often without open friction. In interviews, local practitioners reported that the most important thing was the authentic transmission of the teachings, and not necessarily the resolution of who the true Karmapa was. But doubt persisted, especially among those more attentive to the lineage's origins. Among academics and researchers of spirituality, the case remained a reference study. Western psychology, influenced by decades of investigation into post-death consciousness, including the studies of Elizabeth Kübler-Ross, began to explore the idea of multiple identity not just as a pathology, but as a transgenerational phenomenon. Kübler-Ross, in her final writings before retiring from public life, had already suggested that human experience could contain memories that do not belong to us individually, but that we carry through paths we do not yet understand. In the United States, the work of Ian Stevenson and his successor Jim Tucker accumulated hundreds of documented cases. Very young children in various countries reported specific memories of past lives with details that, in many instances, could be confirmed. The methodology was rigorous: family interviews, verification of names, locations, and habits. Cases recorded in India, Sri Lanka, and even post-war Germany showed similar patterns, memories emerging around age 2 or 3 and gradually fading as the child grew. What made the case of the two Karmapas unique, however, was the institutional context. While other reports emerged spontaneously and in isolation, this was a 1,000-year-old system built to recognize, train, and legitimize reincarnations. It was a documented practice with clear expectations, yet it now faced a fundamental contradiction: two legitimate manifestations of the same title. For scholars, the question shifted from who is right to what does this duality reveal about the nature of the mind? From the 2000s onward, this inquiry began to inspire new lines of research, crossing spirituality, neuroscience, and cultural studies. And at the center of this convergence remained the calm gaze of two men, both claiming to remember what they lived before they were born. In 2004, the world lost Elizabeth Kübler-Ross, whose journey had forever transformed how the West understood death, grief, and the possibility of the continuity of consciousness. Her legacy remained especially alive among those seeking to investigate the threshold between the psychological and the spiritual. In the same year, the debate over the two Karmapas continued without resolution, but it was no longer a binary choice. For many, it was the beginning of a broader understanding of spiritual identity, memory, and the multiple expressions of a single lineage. In Tibet, China maintained control over the narrative of Urgyen Trinley Dorje, using his image to reinforce an institutionalized version of the Buddhist tradition. However, after his escape, authorities faced a dilemma: keep him as a symbol of legitimacy or discard him as a traitor. The impasse reflected the complexity of a spiritual phenomenon embedded in a geopolitical plot. In practice, the attempt to manipulate an ancient process of spiritual recognition had spiraled out of control. Urgyen Trinley, for his part, continued his trajectory with remarkable autonomy. His public statements began to move away from institutional rigidity, approaching contemporary themes such as the environment, the role of women in Buddhism, and the need for interfaith dialogue. Between 2017 and 2019, he spent long periods in the United States and Europe, including discreet visits to Germany, where he met communities deeply involved with Tibetan Buddhism since the 1980s. Trinley Dorje also intensified his presence in Europe, participating in interfaith events and establishing dialogue with scholars and spiritual leaders. His decision to marry, though unexpected, was met with empathy by many Western communities, who saw the choice as a sign of human authenticity, not a break from tradition. Today, both Karmapas remain active, with thousands of followers worldwide. Neither has declared the other invalid. The parallel existence of two recognized figures, rather than weakening the tradition, has opened space for new interpretations. Some masters have begun to suggest that the enlightened mind can manifest simultaneously in more than one body, a concept known in Buddhism as nirmanakaya, or manifestation body. For scholars following the line of investigation started by Karmapa Kübler-Ross and Ian Stevenson, this case continues to offer valuable material. Not just for its religious implications, but for what it reveals about human memory, identity, and the boundaries between the biographical and the transbiographical. The question of who the true Karmapa is may never be resolved satisfactorily. But the existence of these two figures, both coherent, both consistent in their accounts, points to an even deeper question. What if the mystery of consciousness isn't about choosing one version over another, but about accepting that both contain fragments of a greater truth? In the end, what remains is a reverent silence before the inexplicable, and a careful listening to those who, while still in childhood, seem to remember something the rest of the world has forgotten.